Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our last lecture of the 2020-2021 academic school year, which we are blessed to offer both as a live-streamed event and an in-person experience. This has been a long time coming. We're so grateful for those of you who are gathered here with us tonight, here in person, and for those watching online. You're in for a treat tonight. My name is Cameron Zeller, and I'm a fourth-year member of Markets and Morality and will be the MC for the evening. Being a part of Markets and Morality has been a transformational experience of my past 4 years at Hope. The opportunity to engage with people who think about big ideas concerning economic, political, and social institutions, and also appreciate the Orthodox Christian faith is very unusual, even at a place like Hope. So I'm grateful for the space this organization provides for students. This year, our goal is to explore what it means to be humbly optimistic and confidently hopeful about the future. Even the fact that we're here, able to gather in person and online today, is a testament to the fruit of having hope and optimism during such a time as this. Additionally, as you will soon see, Dr. Elzinga, or Mr. Elzinga as he is called at the University of Virginia, according to the tradition started by the founder of the college, Thomas Jefferson, is a person who embodies humble optimism and confident hope about how free markets have and will continue to contribute to human flourishing, as well as the hope laid out by the Christian tradition. If talking about big ideas, hope, optimism sound compelling to you, please consider reaching out to Markets and Morality to learn more about future events and what it means to be more involved with the student organization. We encourage you to email marketsandmorality@hope.edu, no spaces, and check out our Facebook and Instagram pages in the meantime for more information. One housekeeping matter before I introduce our speaker. We appreciate Mr. Elzinga's willingness to answer questions about his lecture, so I want to direct your attention to our Q&A function for the evening. Before we begin, please head to www.slido.com. That is www.slido.com. and log in with the code FREEDOM in all lowercase letters, FREEDOM. Once you log in, you'll be able to submit your questions and see questions from other participants. We encourage you to submit your questions as you think of them throughout Mr. Elzinga's lecture. There's a place to add your name, and we ask that you share your name with your question so that we can reduce our social distance even as we are physically distant. Additionally, if you see a question on the Slido dashboard that you would like Mr. Elzinga to answer, please upvote the question. We will give questions with the most votes priority when it comes time for the Q&A. Again, please log into our Q&A by going to www.slido.com using the code for our event, FREEDOM. Now, it is my pleasure to announce our speaker for the evening. Mr. Kenneth G. Elzinga is the Robert C. Taylor Professor of Economics at the University of Virginia. His introductory economics course there attracts approximately 1,000 students each year, which is the largest class offered at the University of Virginia. Since Mr. Elzinga has taught at the University of Virginia since 1967, this means that Mr. Elzinga has impacted well over 50,000 students during his teaching career. He is an expert in antitrust economics and has testified in many precedent-setting antitrust cases, which include 4 Supreme Court cases. Additionally, he is known for his set of mystery novels, which he penned under the name Marshall Jevons. The novels feature a protagonist that employs economic analysis to solve crimes. He's also served on the board here at Hope College 2 times. Mr. Elzinga received his BA from Kalamazoo College, his master's degree and doctorate from Michigan State, and honorary doctorates from K College and Gordon College. Before I hand over the floor, I want to share one story with you that I think captures Mr. Elzinga's character quite well. As I sat down to write this introduction, I watched a few of Mr. Elzinga's past lectures online to help inspire my writing. During one session of audience questions, Mr. Elzinga observed that the Apostle Paul begins most of his letters to the early churches saying that he is a slave to Jesus. That is Paul's credential. That's his authority, and that's why the people should listen to what he has to say. Mr. Elzinga then asks, in a world that's so oriented towards scholarly and worldly accomplishments, What would it be like for a professor with an impressive resume and long list of credentials to be introduced as a slave to Jesus? In the short time that I spent with Mr. Elzinga, I can see that he embodies what it means to serve God. So above all else, I want you to know that today you're going to hear from a man who truly belongs to Jesus. We're truly honored to have you here, Mr. Elzinga. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Thank you, Cameron, very much. And before I begin my prepared remarks, I have to say that it's been, I'm not sure the right word, I'll just say an emotional experience for me to be back at Hope College. I've been here many times. My connection to Hope goes back to even when I was younger than any of you in this room, because I had hoped, no pun intended, to be a student at Hope College when I was in high school. And that was not just a financial option for me. I lived in Kalamazoo, and the opportunity to live at home and not live in a dorm, and I had a part-time job in Kalamazoo, and I was also a tennis player and had a partial tennis scholarship to Kalamazoo College. That enabled me to go to Kalamazoo College, but not go to Hope College. I did the best thing I could not graduating from Hope College. I married a Hope College graduate and had that connection. And then later on was invited to serve on the board of trustees of this school. That brought me back many times to Holland to serve with a remarkable group of men and women who care passionately for this school. I learned in being on the board that not only when you're on the board of trustees of Hope College are you expected to give wise counsel and advice, you're also expected to give money to the school. And I came to realize it would have been cheaper to go here as a student than to become here as a board member. But, and then walking around the campus was, I got here Sunday night, and it was a gorgeous evening, but it was a poignant time to walk around because so many of you were in your dorm rooms, and COVID-19 had just restricted what would normally be hundreds of people out in the Grove and so on, and that was sad for me. It's been sad for me at the University of Virginia as well. I like to be with students, and students are closed off from access to faculty. Faculty are closed off from access even to other faculty. So it's a very special treat to come here and see live students. In the fall of last year, I taught 1,300 students, which was a record number for me. 1,300 students for a whole semester, and never saw one of them because it was all taught remotely, and that made me very sad. It's an experience of many different emotional dimensions to be back here at Hope College. It's a very special place. And if you ever wonder, are students more or less free to pursue ideas at a Christian school like Hope College or a secular school like the University of Virginia, where I teach? I would give the nod to the Christian school. I'm not sure I could give this lecture in an econ class at UVA. Now, students have a right to know the credentials of a speaker. So in the spirit of what lawyers call full disclosure, let me mention a couple items that will at least involve partial disclosure. The writings of C.S. Lewis, particularly the book Mere Christianity and the essays in God in the Dock. Cameron, could we see the next slide, please? These two books, Mere Christianity and a group of essays by Lewis in a book entitled God in the Dock, these were very important to me in my own conversion or deepening of the Christian faith when I was in graduate school. And ever since that time, ever since encountering these two books, I've had a keen interest in Lewis. I've visited his rooms at Oxford University. I've walked Addison's Walk, where he used to walk with J.R.R. Tolkien. I've been to Lewis's home, the Kilns. Could we see the next slide, please, Cameron? And I've gone to the Wade Center. If you're ever at Wheaton College, right adjacent is the Wade Center, which has a collection of Lewis things. I've been to the pub in Oxford where the Inklings met. Could I see the next slide? That's the eagle and the bird, or the child, where Lewis used to meet with other scholars. And then, could I see the next slide, Cameron? This is his home, the Kilns, which has now become sort of like a study center for Lewis endeavors. So if you're ever outside of Oxford, this is a wonderful place to visit as well. And then finally, Cameron, could I see the next slide? This is taken in my home. These are the books I have about C.S. Lewis in my personal library. I've not read them all, but I'm prone to purchase most any book that comes along that's about Lewis. I don't consider myself a Lewis scholar, but I'm more than an admirer. Let's put me in the category of someone who takes Lewis seriously, okay? Now here's the pedagogical format for this evening. I'm going to lecture, and then as Cameron indicated, we're going to have time for questions at the end. I'm a professor, I give lots of lectures, but I sometimes really enjoy the Q&A more than the lecture. Now I'm going to make two contentions this evening. The first one is that the philosophy of C.S. Lewis, who is believed by many people to be the premier Christian apologist in the 20th century, this philosophy fits very comfortably within what Adam Smith, the founder of the discipline of economics, called the obvious and simple system of natural liberty. In fact, I'm going to argue that the Christian faith, as it was espoused and defended by Lewis, is an ally of free market conservatives and libertarians against the Leviathan state. And my second contention is that if you dig into Lewis's writings, if you go right down to their foundation in the life and teachings of Jesus, you continue to find a theology that squares with Adam Smith's obvious and simple system of natural liberty. Now, those are my two portmanteau contentions, and I'm going to try and unpack them right now. And I don't have a lot of time to unpack them in detail, so if you've got a seatbelt in here, fasten it. We're going to move quickly. And let me start with Lewis himself. So the year is 1943. It is during the height of World War II. And Lewis was asked to present his views on democracy. Now, at the time, he was teaching at Oxford, and he was also speaking to student and military groups. And he was recording talks that were broadcast to improve the morale of the soldiers. And some of these were talks that contained the elements of the Christian faith. And these later became the basis for Lewis's famous description and defense of the Christian faith in the book called Mere Christianity, which was on the screen just a moment ago. Now, England at the time was locked into a desperate struggle with the totalitarian regime of Nazi Germany. And many assumed that when Lewis was asked to give views on democracy, he would offer a flag-waving, ringing affirmation of democracy in general and of Great Britain in particular. But this was not the case. Cameron, could I see the next slide? This is a long quote, but let me go through it. I'm going to read it. You can read it on the screen as well, because it sets the tone for much of what I'm going to say about Lewis and the market economy. He says, I'm a Democrat, small d Democrat, because I believe in the fall of man. I think most people are Democrats for the opposite reason. A great deal of democratic enthusiasm descends from the ideas of people like Rousseau, who believed in democracy because they thought mankind so wise and good that everyone deserved a share in the government. The danger of defending democracy on these grounds is that they're not true. I find that they're not true without looking further than myself. And Lewis says, I don't deserve a share in governing a hen roost, we might say a chicken coop, much less a nation, nor do most people. The real reason for democracy is just the reverse. Mankind is so fallen. Notice the sort of Reformation theology here of the depravity of man. Mankind is so fallen that no man can be trusted with unchecked power over his fellows. Aristotle said that some people were only fit to be slaves. I do not contradict him, but I reject slavery because I see no men fit to be masters. So Lewis's point here is that in a fallen world, democracy is our best option for governing, not only because men shouldn't be servants, but because no one is fit to be a master. And his reflections on government, his reflections on authority, echo that of Lord Acton, who's famous for, in particular, one quote: "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." Now, I'm not sure what this says about me as a person, but over the course of my career teaching at the University of Virginia, I've been approached to run for Congress in my district. The odd thing is I've been approached by 3 different political parties to run for Congress: the Republicans, the Democrats, and the Libertarian Party. Now, C.S. Lewis was approached by men with similar political ambitions for him because he was a very famous scholar. And he proposed, perhaps with tongue-in-cheek, the creation of an entirely new political party. And let's see what Lewis wrote. Cameron, could we see the next slide? He said, "Could we start a stagnation party, which at general elections would boast now that during its term of office, no event of the least importance had taken place?" Now, Lewis had no training in economics that I know of, but his views on what he believed the fallen nature of man left him uncomfortable when men were given control over the lives and the property of others. He viewed limited government as a necessary evil. And he was quick to point out that for the human condition, government, he used the metaphor, it was medicine, it was not food. Now let's look at this very profound quote, and I want you to note the strain of libertarianism within it. Cameron, could we see the next slide? It starts out, "of all the tyrannies." I want to come back to that statement in a moment, but let me just walk through what Lewis said here. Of all the tyrannies, a tyranny exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. Now think about that sentence for a moment. What is Lewis saying here? A tyranny that operates for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It may be better to live under robber barons. Now, my field of economics is antitrust economics. So robber barons is like living under monopolists, people who exploit you because you have no other choice to go in the marketplace. And Lewis says it may be better to live under monopolists than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron or the monopolist's cruelty may sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. To be cured against one's will and cured of states which we may not regard as disease is to be put on a level of those who have not yet reached the age of reason, or those who never will, to be classed with infants, imbeciles, and domestic animals. Now that first line, the first 4 words of all the tyrannies struck me because, and this is just a footnote comment, Lewis also wrote an essay that affected me profoundly in terms of my view of humans. It's called The Weight of Glory, a very brilliant essay in a little book with 5 of his essays. And in that book is an essay on the inner ring, the inner ring. It's a very sobering essay to read if you live in academic circles as we do. And in that essay, he says, of all the passions, notice the parallel here, of all the tyrannies, and now he's writing of all the passions, the passion for the inner ring is most skillful in making a person who is not yet a very bad person do very bad things. Friedrich Hayek, who was a Nobel Prize winner in the discipline of economics, wrote about what he famously called the fatal conceit. And there Hayek understood that fatal conceit was at the taproot of central planning. Lewis came to the same conclusion as Hayek, that the promises of central planning were a fatal conceit, but he came at it from a very different angle, centering his observation on the book of Genesis and not on economic analysis, centering his analysis on the Reformation and the doctrine of the fallen nature of man. Lewis wrote these words, and Cameron, could we see the next slide? All that can really happen under socialism or central planning is that some men will take charge of the destiny of the others. They will be simply men, none perfect, some greedy, cruel, and dishonest. The more completely we are planned, the more powerful they will be. Have we discovered some new reason why this time power should not corrupt as it had done before? Now, in writing about the welfare state, which was coming into England during Lewis's time, He was as, as blunt as any free market conservative or libertarian, and 180 degrees from any politician on the progressive left. Cameron, could we see the next slide, please? This is also something Lewis wrote. The question has become whether we can discover any way of submitting to the worldwide paternalism of a technocracy without losing all personal privacy and independence. Is there any possibility of getting the welfare state's honey and avoiding the sting? Let us make no mistake about the sting. To live his life in his own way, to call his house his castle, to enjoy the fruits of his own labor, to educate his children as his conscience directs, to save for their prosperity after his death, these are wishes deeply ingrained in civilized man. Now notice, I want you to particularly notice Lewis's words here. He is not writing of the benefits of a free society for the elites, the kind of students that he taught at Oxford and Cambridge. He's not writing about the benefits of a free society for his illustrious literary friends, J.R.R. Tolkien, Dorothy Sayers, and others. Lewis is writing about ordinary Englishmen for ordinary Englishmen who could not be studying at Oxford or Cambridge or be engaged in the writing of books. As a Christian, as one who viewed all men as created in God's image and therefore of great value, Lewis wanted for ordinary people a world in which their home was their castle, where the fruits of their labor, however modest, would not be taxed away, and where their children were seen as theirs to raise in accord with their conscience and not the state's, and where inheritances were seen as property to be protected by the state, not confiscated by the state. Lewis, to my knowledge, never used the word libertarian or conservative to describe an ideology. He was an extraordinary wordsmith. He probably wouldn't have liked those terms. As a follower of Jesus, Lewis thought more in a biblical taxonomy. He did use the word freeborn. Cameron, could we see that slide? So Lewis liked this word, freeborn, and used it several times. And he wrote these words. Can I just see the next slide, Cameron? Thank you. He wrote, I believe a man is happier and happy in a richer way if he had the freeborn mind. But I doubt whether he can have this without economic independence. For economic independence allows an education not controlled by government, and in adult life it is the man who needs and asks nothing of government, who can criticize its acts and snap his fingers at its ideology. Close quote. Now, Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, became very much the rage among the political left in the past few years, because finally it seemed like someone had come along who made a data-dense, clinically dispassionate case for government-sponsored, government-mandated economic equality. Involved an economic case for high tax rates on the well-to-do to make the poor less poor. Lewis would have seen through this in a minute. Cameron, could we see the next slide, please? This is what he wrote about equality. When equality is treated not as a medicine or a safety gadget, but as an ideal, we might put it this way, when it's not a safety net, but an ideal, we begin to breed that stunted and envious state of mind which hates all superiority. That mind is the special disease of democracy. It will kill us all if it grows unchecked. And then Lewis added that every intrusion of the spirit that says, I'm as good as you, into our personal life and spiritual life is to be resisted, just as every intrusion of bureaucracy or privilege into our politics. And he concluded, God's love for us is not measured by our social rank or our intellectual talents. If there is equality, it is in his love, not in us. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia attracts readers of all ages and all across the spectrum. I'm struck at times by some of the most secular colleagues I have who have acquainted their children with the Chronicles of Narnia. Can we see the next slide, please? So this is a photograph, open and shut, of the wardrobe. And if you've read the Chronicles of Narnia, you can't possibly even expunge from your mind the amazing way it starts with this wardrobe. This is actually the wardrobe that was the inspiration for the Chronicles of Narnia. It is the most famous wardrobe in the world. Now, that's a funny statement, but some wardrobe has to be the most famous in the world, and I think it would be hard to dispute that this one isn't. It's been the subject of many, many millions of people have read about it. It's been the subject of movies and so on. If you went to the Wade Center at Wheaton College, remember I showed you the slide of that earlier? That wardrobe, the wardrobe itself, is at the Wade Center. A good friend of mine who taught economics at Wheaton College was the one who acquired that wardrobe at an auction. It's kind of a funny story. His name was Bob Bartell, and Bob was charged by Wheaton College, who was trying to build up a collection of Lewis things, to go and bid on this wardrobe. That people knew a bunch of Lewis stuff was coming up for auction. And I think Bob was given $10,000. Now, this was years ago. $10,000 was a lot of money for a Christian college. And he was given $10,000 to say, try and get this for Wheaton College. And Bob went to the auction, and the auction ended up being just between two people, but that's all it takes to bid a price up. He was bidding against a guy named Walter Hooper, who was a biographer of Lewis and was the executor of Lewis's estate. So Hooper was trying to buy this into the Lewis estate and probably was using money from Lewis in some sense, or royalties. But he got into this bidding war, and Bob got carried away and bid it up to $25,000, and Hooper dropped out at $25,000. Bob had to go back to Wheaton and explain to Wheaton, they were shocked at what he had done. But now everybody would applaud it. That wardrobe probably is worth $500,000 now, but nobody wants to part with it. And it's very interesting to go to, I've been at the Wade Center. If you ever go there at a time when a child comes, maybe with a parent, it's an amazing thing to see. This child's eyeballs will just get like this, and they'll want to climb into it because they think there's magic in that wardrobe. What genius to take a wardrobe that was in his home and turn it into the most famous wardrobe in the world. Now, in the Narnia tales, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, there's a scene in which the Pevensie children have become king and queen. You may remember that from your own reading. And Lewis describes their kingdom this way: and they made good laws and kept the peace and generally stopped busybodies and interferers and encouraged ordinary people who wanted to live and let live. It's almost out of a libertarian credo of how the Pevensie children behaved as king and queen. Now, I mentioned Lewis never pretended to be an economist. So far as I know, he never took an economics course. But he knew that economic utopias of the sort that bedeviled the 20th century had a very disturbing propensity either to fail or they required enforcement at the point of a gun. And Lewis also understood that no economic system would ever produce heaven on earth. And while many of Lewis's academic counterparts in the humanities, bear in mind he was an English professor, they were attracted to Rousseau and the natural goodness of man. But Lewis believed in the fall of Adam and the expulsion from the garden. And like a good economist, Lewis understood that poverty, not prosperity, was the natural order of things. Now, I'm going to give you a name now that's probably foreign to virtually everybody in this auditorium. It's the name of a very famous singer, at one time famous, named Frank Sinatra. And he had a famous theme song entitled My Way. And if you're in the audience and you have no idea who Frank Sinatra is, he once was as big as the Beatles. And if you don't know who the Beatles are, they once were as big as Beyonce. Now, I want you to consider two words, just two words, that comprise the title of Frank Sinatra's theme song, My Way, and contrast them with two of the most famous words of Jesus, follow me. My way versus follow me. What a contrast. Frank Sinatra sings My Way, and the Bible teaches, if I may use some King James language here, there is a way which seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. Or a more modern translation might be, there's a way, note the word way again, there's a way that appears to be right, but in the end, it's all wrong. Now, the scriptures of the Christian faith don't square with a philosophy of my way. Cameron, if we could just quickly go through 3 verses. First of all, many are the plans in the mind of man, but it's the purpose of the Lord that will stand. And the next slide, in his heart, a man plans his course, but the Lord establishes his steps. And finally, the next one from Zechariah. So he said to me, this is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel, not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord Almighty. So this promotion of ourselves, the pursuit of our own desires, the I did it my way, embodied in the Frank Sinatra song, can run rampant in a free market. So what's the problem with free market capitalism? Certainly that it doesn't deliver the goods, it does. Certainly not that it requires greed, because it doesn't. When G.K. Chesterton was asked what's wrong with the world, he replied, I am. I'm what's wrong. And like Chesterton, whom Lewis admired, Lewis would have recognized what's wrong with the market system is it's populated with people like us, people who come to believe that it's by our might and our power that things are accomplished. And I think this is the rub. Because the market system is such an extraordinary engine of abundance for so many, there are all too many who can be deluded into thinking, I did this. I'm responsible for this. And into this ostensibly libertarian proposition comes the gospel of Jesus Christ that claims freedom is to be found in following Jesus. Now, I will tell you, many of my students at UVA are totally puzzled and baffled by this. They wonder, how on earth could following someone else lead to my being free? And the answer that I tell them is, well, never, unless the person you're following holds the key to an abundant life. And that is one of the claims of Jesus Christ. He said, I've come to have life that you can have it more abundantly. Many students at Hope College would know that. For many of my students at UVA, that's like, really? Let me ask a rhetorical question here. Did you ever think about how remarkable is the name Adam Smith? According to the Bible, Adam was the first man. And Smith is the most common surname in the English language. So an Adam Smith writes the most famous book about economics, and it's about the economic flourishing, not of kings and potentates, and not of religious authorities and political authorities, but it's about how ordinary people, the Smiths of the world, might prosper through what Adam Smith called the obvious and simple system of natural liberty. And the strength and the weakness, the yin and the yang of Adam Smith's obvious and simple system of natural liberty are really two sides of the same coin. Its strength is how free markets improve our standard of living in a way that is freedom compatible. When Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, the experience of most people over the whole span of mankind's existence was one of grinding, hopeless poverty. And it was poverty with no relief, poverty with no real expectation of improvement. And Smith decided to try and explore and explain the aberrations. How did some nations manage to escape this? And hence the full title of Smith's masterpiece. Cameron, can we see the next slide? It's an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. But the other side of the coin is that the free market makes no promise of changed hearts for the Smiths of the world, for the common people. A free society allows human virtues such as these to be exercised, but a free society, by definition, can't require or mandate changed hearts. So libertarians, free market conservatives, these are people who care about freedom, but so does the Christian faith. Consider the following words of Jesus. Cameron, could we see the next slide? You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. This is right straight out of the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 32. These are very common words in the academic world. Cameron, could we see the next slide? This is where I teach. This is a university founded by Thomas Jefferson. And on Cabell Hall, is that, in Greek, is that caption. You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free. It's on many, many secular colleges and universities. It would seem laudable in any university setting. What would separate Christians from many libertarians, what I think would give C.S. Lewis pause about mainstream libertarianism, is what happens when you put those words of Jesus in context. You shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free. That's the tail end of an expression that's inscribed on the building at UVA. The front end never got inscribed. Jesus begins by saying, if you abide in my word, you're truly my disciples. Then comes the statement, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Lewis understood and believed something that would be a very hard pill to swallow for anyone who conflates liberty with doing their own thing. The paradox of the Christian gospel is that we are most free when we're doing what we were created to do. And according to Jesus, that means abiding in his words. If you abide in my word, you're truly my disciples, and then the truth will set you free. This word abiding is not a very common word. I just hardly ever hear a University of Virginia student use that word abide. It means living with, and because Christians believe Jesus has been raised from the dead and lives today through his Spirit, then if that's true, Jesus' words, abide in him, make sense. And Jesus explains what abiding means. It means abiding in his word, following his teachings. And therein lies the rub between Jesus and many libertarians. Libertarians believe in freedom, but it's a freedom from guidelines. It's a freedom from control, from anything that stands in your own personal desires and pursuits. Libertarians want to be in control of their own lives. There's a poem called Invictus. It has a very famous part that goes like this. Cameron, could we see this on the screen? You've probably seen this before from the Henley poem Invictus. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I'm the master of my fate. I'm the captain of my soul. And anybody for whom those words seem, wow, that is great, you're probably going to balk at the metaphor of abiding in God's word, or at the idea of following Jesus. I think in this also lies the rub between Jesus and many people on the left, not the free market conservatives and the libertarians, but the people on the left. The teaching of Jesus is even more problematic than it is for many libertarians, because socialists and central planners are often those who seek power over others and whose desire is that the others of the world will follow the dictates of the modern state, not the Spirit of God, which Jesus claims will make one free. So there you have it. There's a very age-old divide that goes back to the beginning of recorded history. It goes back to the story of Adam and Eve. It's a question of authority. Whose authority are we under? And it's also a question of freedom. Is freedom to be valued? Libertarians and free market conservatives would say yes, if only the government would leave us alone to make our own decisions and voluntarily trade with others. But the purpose of that freedom, this is the fork in the road for libertarians who are secular and those who are not. The secular libertarian says the purpose is what I want to make it to be. The poem, I'm the captain of my soul. And the person who's a follower of Jesus says something very different. This person says, I've been created for something higher and better than my own desires. Making much the same point about liberty, the Apostle Peter wrote these words. And Cameron, could we see them? Live as free men, or free men and women, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as servants of God. What sets the freedom of Jesus, and I would contend the freeborn concept of C.S. Lewis, apart from the freedom of Ayn Rand, from the freedom of Milton Friedman, from the freedom of Ludwig von Mises, from the freedom of Friedrich Hayek, from the freedom of Murray Rothbard, is that freedom in Christ is freedom from bondage. Not bondage to the state, but bondage to us. The Christian gospel can't be well understood without an understanding of the Old Testament scriptures, and the Old Testament has two accounts that would have been very familiar to Lewis. The first is the Exodus of the people of Israel from Egypt by God's miraculous provision. For an Israelite living under the rule of Pharaoh would be a libertarian and free market conservative's nightmare. And God thought it was a nightmare too. So he delivered the Israelites from bondage. Chalk one up to freedom. But the second is the giving of the law, the Ten Commandments, to Moses on Mount Sinai. This also involved liberation of the people of Israel, but in a very different fashion. For while the exodus from Egypt meant freedom from slavery, the giving of the law meant freedom for something greater. Lewis would argue that becoming followers of Jesus is not to deny our identity as individuals. Lewis would have said it completes it. It completes our identity. The connection that got lost in Eden is partially regained. And when the shackles of sin are removed from our ankles, we're free to get up, free to go forth, free to follow Jesus as Lord. Lewis would have said, who is freer than the person who chooses to serve, where that is the person's choice? You may not know this about Lewis. He became a Christian after he was a very famous scholar. He was, as he described himself, a reluctant convert, a person who at one point did not want the Christian gospel to be true, but decided that it was. And when he was writing about his own coming to faith, he didn't use the word liberty. He used a word that's very close, kind of a sibling word. He used the word liberation. He wrote, "The hardness of God is kinder than the softness of men, and God's compulsion is our liberation." That's in his book, Surprised by Joy. The Christian gospel tells us what to do with that liberation. It's not the poem Invictus. It's not Frank Sinatra's My Way. It is rather to know God and enjoy him forever, to love God and to love our neighbors. Now, I've quoted a lot of Lewis in this talk. Let me close by quoting something Father Robert Sirico of the Acton Institute wrote. These are words that are very Lewisian. When freedom is divorced from faith, both freedom and faith suffer. Let me say that again. When freedom is divorced from faith, both freedom and faith suffer. Freedom becomes rudderless because truth gives freedom its direction. And where does the truth come from? Well, the Christian faith says it comes from that truth that is derived from the life and teachings of Jesus, who had the temerity, may I use that word? The temerity to say that he is the way, the truth, and the life. Thank you for your attention. I understand we'll have some Q&A afterwards, and I look forward to that. So I will step aside as we get the stage ready for the Q&A. Cameron, thank you for your work on the slides as well.
Thank you, Mr. Elzinga. I'm glad that I had my seatbelt on for that. That was a lot of information that we covered there. So while we wait for the screen to raise, let me remind our audience that you can continue to submit your questions at www.slido.com, SLIDO, with our code FREEDOM, all lowercase, and join our event. So we already have some great questions, so we're going to get started.
So Cameron, how do I know the questions? You see them on a screen, I guess.
Yeah, I'll ask them to you.
Okay.
So you mentioned right here at the end of your talk that Lewis was a reluctant convert. Our first question comes from Sam, who asks, why do you think C.S. Lewis took many years to convert to Christianity? What guided him to eventually know and love God?
Sure. because I'm a scholar and I hang around with lots of people who I admire for their intelligence, but they're not followers of Jesus, I'm very intrigued by anyone who comes to faith late in their life. Billy Graham, a very famous evangelist from my era, used to say in crusades, he used to really challenge older people that they should accept Christ now or they never will, because very few people who are older ever accept Christ. Lewis came to faith in a very subtle way, because he was a student of mythology. He was a genius, first of all, and he knew so much about literature and could recite long passages of it from heart. He had a photographic mind and just an incredible brain power. And he knew a lot about myths. And there was a view in the humanities that the Christ story was just another myth. It was another dying God myth. And Lewis came to believe that there was something different about that gospel story, the dying God of Jesus. And it did not fit the once upon a time myths that he read and that he taught and that he understood as a scholar. And so he came to believe more and more that there was something of substance here as an intellect in his brain. But like a lot of us who come to faith, if we think about it, there's often a person as well. A person who models out what it means to follow Jesus. And Lewis had those people in his life as well. Tolkien being perhaps the most influential, but a couple others as well, who were scholars, and Lewis admired their life of the mind, and they were believers. And Lewis said, how could that be? They're as smart as I am. What do they see in this? And Lewis saw a godliness in them that he did not see in the secular academic world. And I think, I'm trying to put it in a mechanical way and putting aside the work of the Holy Spirit, just trying to explain it from a human perspective. I would say for Lewis's conversion, it was a confluence of coming to understand the historical credibility of the gospel story, that it was not a myth, and then seeing godly people in the academy that he admired who were followers of Jesus. Now, that is not in any way to, in that humanistic explanation, to ignore the work of the Holy Spirit, of God's Holy Spirit coming into Lewis's life and converting him against his own wishes. He was not a person who wanted to use an old Christian cliche, bend the knee. He wanted to be a person who was like the Invictus poem. Hey, I'm a famous guy here. I control my own life. And the gospel comes along and says, no, you're to be a follower of Jesus. You're to bend the knee to the gospel. And he did that. And he's such a great guy with words. And then after being the most reluctant, he writes a book about it, and it's called Surprised by Joy. Now, if you know much about Lewis, you know that there's a double entendre in that word joy. It means a person, but it also means a phenomenon. Because being the most reluctant convert, he came to find out what joy was, the joy of knowing Jesus. And his life had not been marked by joy. It had been marked by tremendous accomplishments, but not by what you would call the human emotion of joy. That came after. And, of course, Lewis loved paradox. And he thought, what a paradox that I've submitted myself to something. I've become a slave to Christ, and in the process I find joy. And I think, wow, I wish more of my students at UVA could understand that the gospel offers a cross to pick up and carry. It does. It is challenging to follow Jesus. When I look at the age of many of you, you are swimming in a culture that makes it very challenging to be a follower of Jesus. And if you don't know that here at Hope College, you will learn it when you leave this community. But there's also a joy of submission. What a paradox. So that's the story in a nutshell. You can read it in his book, Surprised by Joy, is one place where there's an account of that.
We are so happy that we've been able to hear so much about Lewis's life and his walk in faith. But we have one question that's wondering about you. So how, as a Christian, does your faith influence your economic thought and ideology?
Sure. I'm going to take the question and answer it at two levels, and I'll try not to make it a lecture because it could easily turn into that. I'll say, let me take the easier one first, and that's my job. So I teach economics at the University of Virginia. How does the Christian faith affect how I do my job? It affects it a lot. It affects it to give you an illustration of it, in two ways. One is the gospel saying, whatsoever you do in word or in deed, do it as unto the Lord. So that means when I do research, when I teach a lecture, somehow I've got to think, well, what does that mean, Ken, to do that as unto the Lord? Well, I figure it means try and do it well. Don't be sloppy about it. Don't be casual about it, because you're to do this as unto the Lord. And that was a big thing to me when I came to understand the Christian faith, because I always thought what you did is, if you were a pastor or an evangelist, you did that unto the Lord. If you were a missionary doctor, you did that unto the Lord. But I was being challenged to say, well, you're going to teach economics. You're going to do research in economics. How do you do that as unto the Lord? And I thought, well, I guess it means to try and do it well, to the best of my ability. But the second avenue where the Christian faith affects me is an image of Jesus, a story of Jesus that is an image in my mind. And it's actually a painting on my wall as well. Sarah Estelle might remember this. I have a painting on my office wall, not of Jesus on a cross. It's not a painting of a cross. Most Christian art somehow involves the cross, the crucifix, the empty cross, the ascension to the cross, the coming down from the cross. This is a picture of Jesus washing the feet of a disciple. And I think, well, what does it mean, Ken? You're a professor, you're well known at UVA, you've got an endowed chair. Big deal. The gospel comes along and says, you know what you got to be willing to do? Humble yourself and get down on the floor and wash the feet of your students. Wow, that will affect your work. If that starts to get into your head, what does that mean? Well, it means, for example, if a student comes to my office and it's getting near the end of my office hours and I'm ready to go home, well, if I'm a foot washer, the foot washer doesn't get to just go home and say, hey, sorry, I'm out of here. The foot washer stays and washes feet. So that affects my view of my profession, of my work as a teacher and a professor. How it affects my view of economics is probably somewhat similar to what I presented in this talk. I'm not drawn to utopias. I don't think we'll ever have a heaven on earth, because my understanding of the scripture says that's not going to happen. Jesus is ushering in a kingdom, but it's always being ushered in under the duress of a fallen world. And so I don't expect, as an economist, there ever be a utopia in which everybody's happy with what they have. Then I try to think, well, what is the best way where we can at least make people have food on their table and clothes and an education? And the evidence to me seems to be that a market system tends to do that better than central planning. So that affects my view of markets. Are they perfect? No. The gospel tells me they're not perfect, because the gospel tells me there's never going to be utopia. So it's a matter of what we might think of as second best or the best alternative. So I spend a lot of my time in a research capacity and as a consultant in antitrust, trying to think about how do we use antitrust to make markets more competitive so they serve consumers better. And so mergers, pricing strategy, monopolistic tactics, these are all things I care about, because as a matter of public policy, I think they may have some way of making markets more competitive. And if markets are more competitive, consumers have more choice at lower prices and better quality products. They're not as dependent upon the state for the provision of goods and services. They have options in the marketplace. Now, that marketplace is going to be pervaded by people who might try to cheat you, but that can happen with a government bureaucrat as well. So we want to have safeguards on markets in terms of protecting property rights, giving people the ability to enter into contracts that protect them. All of that becomes part of what I study as an economist, and my Christian view affects that.
Thank you, yes. On a very different topic, but one you referenced right at the start, how would C.S. Lewis or a Lewis-esque person respond to the issues and challenges of COVID-19?
Wow. Well, in some ways we have an answer to that, because as hard as COVID-19 has been on us, and it has been hard, I mean, I know students, it's hard. Believe me, for professors like myself who like to be with students, it's been hard for me. It's made me sad, not clinically depressed, but sad to be deprived of the ability to do what I think I'm called to do. Hang around with students, have students in my home, see students in my office, and so on. But Lewis lived during World War II, when London was being bombed, cathedrals were on fire. I mean, it was a horrific time for Great Britain. And Mere Christianity came out of that time. So he lived through very, very hard times. And what did he do? He encouraged people with the gospel. You know, I mean, it's almost inconceivable now to imagine a world at war, and the BBC comes to a professor and says, "Would you give some talks?" And these talks become Mere Christianity. They're talks about the Christian faith. When Lewis was asked the question, how can you do research and study during a war? He said, well, the war will be over sometime, we hope, and the world of books and ideas need to continue. So we just keep doing this as best we can under the conditions. So Lewis, I am sure, would have still tried to write. He would have worn a mask, I suspect. He would have grumbled about it, because you can tell he's got this strong streak of independence about him. But he would have wanted the COVID-19 thing to end. He would have been delighted if technology came in and helped people. He would have gotten a shot and moved on. The thing he wouldn't have done is he would have been sad, but he wouldn't have complained heavily about it. I think that's because he had, after he became a Christian, he had this strong view about the fall, that in some ways COVID-19 is the natural state of affairs in a fallen world. And if we don't have it, we should be grateful for the common grace that allows us to function with one another without a pandemic. That's a very interesting question, whoever raised that.
This seems like an appropriate question for a professor at Mr. Jefferson's University. So Garrett asks, what are your thoughts on the separation of church and state? If government grants freedom, what is to be done of those who misuse it? He suggests examples like abortion, but also monopolies.
Yeah. Well, that's a profound question. I do believe in the separation of church and state, in the sense that I believe Mr. Jefferson wanted it to happen, which is different than what many people who claim Mr. Jefferson's views in support of their views. In some ways, and I'm not the only person who thinks this way, and I'm not the only Christian who thinks this way. There are many Jefferson scholars who are secular who believe on this issue of separation of church and state that Jefferson was hijacked. His views were hijacked in terms of this alleged wall of separation. Separation of church and state to Mr. Jefferson meant nothing more and nothing less than that the government should not sanction or give favor to a particular religion. It did not mean that religion was to be expunged from the public square. Jefferson understood that. One evidence we have of that, very powerful evidence, is that when he was arguing for the foundation of the University of Virginia, which would be the first publicly funded university in the United States. All the other schools at the time, the Harvards and the Yales, were all private, and often most of them started by Christians. He said, I want a university that's publicly funded, and it would be secular. Secular in the sense that it would not favor any particular religion or denomination. Some people wrote Mr. Jefferson, this was a radical idea. It seems common to us now. We have Michigan State, the University of Michigan, they're publicly funded, and nobody says we shouldn't have them, or only hardcore libertarians would say they should be privatized. But Mr. Jefferson a letter was written by some Baptists, and it said, well, what's the role of religion? And Mr. Jefferson said, well, we're going to have a room in the rotunda. Now, this is the key building on the grounds of the university. And we'll have a room in there, and students can get together, and they can talk about religion. It's just that the university won't sanction any particular religion. Anybody who wants, now Jefferson probably wished that they would come in, and out of the discussion they would all become good Unitarians, probably is what he thought. But nonetheless, he didn't dictate that, and he did make provision for religious discussion in the public square at the University of Virginia. So the views that Mr. Jefferson wants religion expelled from public discussion on issues like abortion and so on. That just is not Mr. Jefferson at all. It's a strategic hijacking of Thomas Jefferson's views. So that's a partial answer to your question. Now, I've had to fight that battle at UVA. When I arrived at UVA, Christian student groups were not allowed to meet on grounds. And I couldn't get over that. I said, really? I mean, they meet on grounds at Michigan State University, where I was. And so we went back and looked at the writings of Mr. Jefferson, and we found these writings. And we went to the administration, and they said, I guess you're right. So Christian groups meet on grounds right now. But the university doesn't favor the InterVarsity group over Fellowship of Christian Athletes, or a Muslim group over a Roman Catholic group, over an evangelical Protestant group. It's just anybody wants to come, have discussions, worship services, or whatever. That's the way I view separation of church and state, the old-fashioned Jeffersonian way of the state does nothing to favor one particular religion, but on the other hand, it does nothing to tax or stop the exercise of religious freedom. Now, the area of abortion is a really good example of something that causes me to be very conflicted. And I'll tell you why. I've observed a lot of my students at UVA, and it may be true at Hope College as well, but my students at UVA, most of whom are not followers of Jesus, they're looking for somewhere for a moral code. Where do I get this? If I'm not looking at Scripture for a moral code, where does it come from? Classic question. What is my source of authority for what I think is right and what I think is wrong? And one of the things that has troubled me is that for many of these students, if the Supreme Court takes a certain view on an issue, take abortion to make the most prominent one, and says abortion is not to be stopped by the state, but is to be protected by the state, that is, for some people, the same as the Supreme Court saying abortion is okay, that it's a good thing. This is a good form of birth control or population control. And I think, oh my word, this is just a court interpreting secular law in our Constitution. It should not be taken as a moral dicta. But if you're swimming around looking for a moral source of authority, it's been sad for me to see students who ask them, well, what are your views on the pro-life issue? I say, well, I kind of go with what the Supreme Court said. The Supreme Court said it's okay, so it's probably okay. And so for me, I kind of cringe at that because it sets the government up not as something I want it to do. I want individuals to be making choices based on what the church, evangelists, Christian missions, colleges like Hope College are teaching as to what it means to be free in Christ, to what it means to follow Jesus. And to have a government body, whether it's the Supreme Court or anybody else, say, this is what is morally proper. That troubles me very much. I have some, not very many, but some atheist friends who are pro-life. And I say, really? I find that really odd at first. And I say, well, why do you think that? And one guy said to me, he said, it happened for me with an OBGYN textbook. He was looking at this textbook on obstetrics, and the first line was to a doctor who's going to be an OBGYN specialist, when you have a female patient and she's pregnant, you now have two patients. And it was just a clever kind of introductory line. So get used to this, a pregnant woman, and you're treating her as her OBGYN doctor. Think of it as having two patients that you're worried about. You're worried about the mom, and you're worried about the baby in the womb. And he looked at that and he thought, that's right, there's two patients, there's two people. And so he became pro-life, not through anything of a Christian tradition, but just the fact that he believed in the importance of life. And now there were two lives, and he believed both of them needed to be protected. Most people in the pro-life position don't come that way, and then most people who are open to the abortion, many of them that I know, come that way through a pronouncement of the Supreme Court. And that's really troubling to me. I don't know a way out of that. There has to be a court that decides certain things. I might have wished Roe v. Wade went a different way, but I am troubled that I see my secular students taking a moral guideline from the Supreme Court.
So Anna Kay is wondering about kind of a strain that you had throughout your talk. So she's wondering about the distinction that you would make between freedom from and freedom for, as well as how Adam Smith and C.S. Lewis would respond.
Yeah, it's really hard to know. I mean, Adam Smith, if you dig into his writings, there was a group of Presbyterian ministers that really affected him. And I think they affected him in terms of his view of the fall. He might not have used that term of the Genesis fall. He certainly was aware of the book of Genesis. He didn't use that Reformation term the way we would use it in kind of Calvin or Luther circles. But Adam Smith was not open with his Christian faith, but he's clearly affected by the culture of it. You couldn't escape it in his day. And so the moral code that he had was very much not dictated by, but he swam in a moral code that came out of a Judeo-Christian tradition. When he looked at freedom, he basically was looking at freedom to buy and sell, to transact, exchange, the word we would use. And he began to see that exchange created value. This person had something and valued it worth $1, and this person over here said, that's worth $2 to me. And they exchange, and value is increased. And Smith was the first person who really saw that. Value was not hoarding a bunch of gold. Value was allowing people to exchange in accord with specialization and division of labor, and the wealth of nations could be explained by that. So freedom for him, he wasn't thinking about abortion issues or anything like that. It was exchange. The government setting up tariffs versus the government removing tariffs, allowing people in England to trade with people in Portugal or preventing people in England from trading with Portugal. The notion of freedom from would be, in that sense, foreign to him. When I try to explain to some of my students the notion of freedom with regard to the Christian faith, what I try to explain to them is that if you take just the 10 Commandments, for example, that while these are do nots, they are, in reality, things that free you. So when the Christian faith comes along to me and says, Ken, you're a married man, don't commit adultery. Now, I have many colleagues who would look upon that and say, that really restricts the sex life of a married man. How could that possibly be a good thing, because it constrains your choice set? And that's the way we teach economics a lot, is if you have a larger choice set, you must be better off, because if you could choose between 3 things, and now you can choose between 5, even if you didn't want the two new choices don't make you worse off, so expanded choice set. That's a principle of economics, but it doesn't explain the whole world. And it certainly doesn't explain the world of morality. The commandment comes along and says, Ken, don't commit adultery. And in the process, you'll have a better marriage. You know, you'll by being sexually faithful to your wife, I hold out the prospect of a more flourishing marriage for you than if you commit adultery and it breaks up your marriage. And I think, wow, that's an interesting thought. A constraint allows for more flourishing. Commandment says, don't steal. I think, well, boy, that's a constraint. Look at that. I think I could steal that. I might get away with it. But the commandment says, don't steal. And in the process, you'll be better off. You'll flourish. And so it's very hard to explain this to secular people. It's very hard to explain it to secular libertarians, because their view is the more freedom, the better. How could that possibly be, how could you possibly be worse off if your choice set is constrained? But you are better off if your choice set is constrained, if the things that you're constrained from doing are things that ultimately will cause you not to flourish, to cause your marriage to go off the rails, to cause you to end up being in trouble with the law, and a whole host of things. So these, in some ways, the commandments are I wasn't around to label them, but I often thought, why label them the 10 Commandments? Maybe to call them the 10 liberations or the 10 freedoms, because in the paradox of the gospel, following Jesus makes us free. free to be who we are intended to be. And in our fallen nature, if we don't follow the teachings of Jesus, we will make choices that will seem to us to be right, but as the scripture says, there is a thing that looks right unto man, but the end thereof is death. And that's bad choices. Choices that Jesus would not have us make.
For our next question, I'll exercise my moderator's prerogative and combine two of the popular questions on Slido. One student asks, if someone were to say man is mostly good and not fallen, how might Lewis or yourself respond? And another student, Jordan, asks, how do you think Lewis would respond to today's popular opinion of people being inherently good? And she adds, respond to the decline of faith in society.
Yeah. Well, Lewis really was an enemy of Rousseau. And he really did see Rousseau, who's a hero in the humanities, to be sure, one of the most important figures ever in Western civilization in the humanities. Lewis thought Rousseau was dead wrong in his view that man was essentially good, or unrestrained man would flourish. Lewis just didn't believe that. He thought the weight of history showed that was not true. The scriptures argued against that. He just thought that was, in Hayek's term, a fatal conceit about men. I don't know as though he ever adopted fully the Calvin view of the depravity of man. That's such a stark term. I'm not sure Lewis would have been real comfortable with that. But he certainly, as the quotes that I indicated today reveal about Lewis, that he was deeply suspicious of anybody having the moral DNA to control the lives of others for their own good. He just did not trust that. He believed that people would put in authority, they would tend to abuse that authority. So the question of, is man essentially good or man essentially evil, is in some ways an important question, and in some ways the problem in answering it is it's put as almost in bifurcated or form, or it's like a dichotomy. Man is both. You know, we are the one creature that the scriptures define as made in the image of God. The imago Dei, we are it. Other simians are not imago Dei. My dog is not imago Dei. Human beings are, and the Bible could not be clearer on that God created man in his own image. Did not create man to be a god, but in his own image. So we're tremendously important in the created order. And we are capable of great goodness because Jesus calls us to that. It makes no sense for Jesus to call us to these things if it were hopeless for us to accomplish any of them. But on the other hand, we're not capable of our own salvation. We simply cannot be good enough. And how do we know that? Because Jesus died on a cross. You know, if we could have done this on our own, there would be no reason, there'd be no rationale for God to send his beloved Son to go through this horrific death on a cross, to have a blood sacrifice for our sins. God could simply say, hey, look, do it on your own or you're in trouble. But he recognized that we couldn't do it on our own. You know, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes on him should not perish, but have eternal life. We're the people for whom that is said. That's an amazing statement. God loved the world so much. One of the hardest things for me to get across to some of my students at UVA, because it's a deep truth about the Trinity, and they have little knowledge of the Christian faith, and this takes you pretty deep, is the relationship between God the Father and God the Son. You know, early on when Jesus is about to be baptized, the scriptures say, this is my beloved Son. And what does it go on to say? In whom I am well pleased. One of my favorite verses in Colossians is, for in him, in Jesus, the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. So it wasn't just some abstract, the God character goes into Jesus. it pleased God that it would dwell in his Son. And then this is the same Son who says, my God, why have you abandoned me? And who dies on a cross. So if we could pull it off on our own, that wouldn't have had to happen. The fact that it did happen is a sign that we are really in need of a redeemer, someone to redeem us. But on the other hand, and thank goodness for the other hand, we're reminded that we are so special that we're created in God's image. And so we're capable of, it's humanly possible for me, corrupt and sinful as I am, to aspire to being a foot washer for my students. The gospel says you're capable of going out and loving your enemy. Really? Who can do that? Well, Jesus says, think about that. And maybe that's what you should be thinking of doing, loving your enemy, turning the other cheek. These statements make no sense if they could never be acted upon. But Jesus looks upon humans as being people who are potentially capable of that kind of goodness. Doesn't say that to a dog, doesn't say that to a chicken, it says that to people made in the image of God. So Rousseau is wrong to think that humans are perfectible. There would be no need for a gospel if that were true. But on the other hand, it's easy to distort the Calvin view of total depravity, because if you take that literally, you'd think, well, we could, it's senseless for me to think about washing the feet of a student because I'm too depraved to ever do that. And Jesus comes along and says, Ken, think about that. What would it mean for you? Start to form your career around a principle like that. You may not literally wash your students' feet, but you serve them in other ways. It's a principle of following Jesus. That's a very sobering principle. Those of you going into the marketplace, think about that. Think about what that means for the person who takes out your trash if you're in an office somewhere. What would it mean that, a person who is somewhat like Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man, is the trash person takes out the trash. You see the person, but you don't really see the person. What would it mean to be so committed to the things of Christ that you could see yourself washing that person's feet? Well, maybe you never wash their feet, but you might start with learning their name. You might start with asking how they're doing. You might start by asking how their family is. Do they have children? Are their kids in school? And maybe you get to the point where you're giving money to help their kid buy books. That's foot washing in some way, not literally, but it's what the principle could involve for some of you.
One student, Luke, asks, how would Lewis weigh in on the current race relations in the United States? Would he consider all races equally fallen at the current time and condition?
Yeah. We don't know a lot about that because Lewis was not exposed. England at the time, England now, a very multiracial society compared to Lewis's day, and particularly Lewis's life at Cambridge and Oxford. We do know that Lewis, after he became a Christian, deeply committed to the view that God loved everyone, and that's what really made people equal, was not that they all had the same education or they all had the same income. The really great equalizer was that they were all loved by God. And Lewis was deeply committed to that proposition, deeply committed. And it manifested itself in ways in which he did care for people in his private life that we know about now, of being extraordinarily generous. One area of Lewis's generosity that just has struck me, because I frequently find myself just overwhelmed with correspondence, particularly digital now, but before that, written correspondence. Lewis wrote hundreds and hundreds of letters to people who were nobodies in terms of the world's stature, people who read his book, heard him on the radio, had questions about the Christian faith, would write him. And the idea that this famous scholar would sit down and spend hours writing letters to people for which, the coin of the realm is publications for a professor. These were not publications. These were letters to everyday people. And he did that. And that to me was a sign that Lewis did have this really equal view. Now, whether the letters were from people of color, probably not in that time. But if they had been, Lewis would have answered them the same way. He didn't look at the credentials of the person and say, "Oh, well, this person is an uneducated person in Liverpool who's writing me. I don't need to worry about that. I worry about the letter from the student at Cambridge." He wasn't that way at all.
So for our last question, maybe we should ask you for some advice. How would you recommend engaging in a secular work or postgraduate environment while deeply abiding in God?
Yeah. When I disciple students at UVA, we spend a lot of time on that topic, really a lot of meetings about a Christian perspective on time management, dating, workplace, models of Christian ministry in the marketplace. If I had to say one thing to you, as I best understand the audience here, it would be not to be ashamed of the gospel. It's a really important thing to take that into the marketplace. You are in an environment now in which some people, sociologists, would call a post-Christian culture. And for a long time, that seemed to be the terminology. I think now it's more an anti-Christian. It isn't just post-Christian, but there's just a lot of hostility to the Christian faith. And so there would be a natural tendency among most of us to say, well, I will really privatize my Christian faith. I'll get involved in a church or something like that. It's sort of like the Rob Dreher Benedict option, where you're just sort of off here by yourself. I admire that book a lot, and there's a lot of truth to it. But if you are taking a job in the secular workplace, I would encourage you to not be ashamed of the gospel, to get that straight, first of all, that when the Apostle Paul says early on, somewhere in the first chapter of Romans, I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it's the power of God unto salvation. So start with that. And then learn to just talk about your Christian faith the way other people talk about their affection for NFL football or golf or their children or whatever, that it's just a natural thing that you talk about. I have found this to be extraordinarily helpful to me in my world of consulting, which for the most part is very, very secular. I work with high-powered attorneys, other economists around the country. I've been fortunate enough to be involved in some very high-profile antitrust cases. Everybody I work with knows I'm a believer. They know I'm a follower of Jesus. That's just one of the kind of quirks of working with Ken Elzinga. He's, as they might put it, he's really religious. But those who get to know me better get to know, well, yeah, he's not just religious. It's a follower of Jesus is the term he would use. He takes a life with Christ really seriously. And as you get to know these people better, you're able to exercise that in them. And I'll just give you a couple examples from my consulting experience. Not at all to pat myself on the back. Someday I may face the Lord, and the Lord will say, Ken, you talked about not being ashamed, but boy, you sure looked ashamed to me a lot. And I'll say, Lord, I guess that's probably right. But so I was talking the other day with a CEO of a company, and she was wrestling with a merger. And it was really hard to know the rights and wrongs and the nature of the deal. These are hard decisions. They're hard to get the right data. And even if you have data and you have good advice from finance people and legal people and so on, nonetheless, when you're the CEO, literally the buck sort of stops with you. And she was struggling with that. And I said, well, Cindy, could I pray for you about that decision? And she just jumped at the chance. I said, yeah, would you? So I prayed for her about that decision. Later on, I get an email from the vice president of the company, who I've known for some time and who is by no means a Christian. But she knows me, knows my faith commitment, and she sends me an email, and she said, I heard that you prayed for Cindy, and it really meant a lot to her. Cindy has got all this weight on her shoulders, and everybody expects her to be, to be the leader of this, that, and the other thing, and it's really hard. And she said that you prayed for her, and it really meant a lot to her. Thank you for doing that. So I'm being thanked for praying for somebody from a non-believer. Now, what's going on here? Well, probably the person who thanks me doesn't believe in prayer in some supernatural sense, but she saw it as a signal that my Christian faith meant that I cared for this person as a person, that they were struggling with a hard decision. So I often pray with people. There's another gal, super smart gal, PhD from MIT, undergraduate from Berkeley. I mean, she's just way ahead of me in terms of intellectual horsepower and economics, but she's afraid of flying. And in her work, she had to fly a lot. She has to get from cross country. She had to get from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco or to New York. And I said, well, Vandy, could I pray for you about your fear of flying? And I knew she wasn't a believer, but for her, it's a signal that I'm not just saying tough luck or get over it or what's wrong with you or something like that, but I know it's a real problem. And I don't have the solution for it. I don't have a pill I can prescribe. So what Vandy knows is that when I don't know what's going on and I face a problem, is I pray about it. And out of affection for her, I pray for her. Now, she now flies, and she doesn't know what to make of that. She doesn't know whether that's an answer to prayer. In a way, she's like Lewis, the reluctant convert. She doesn't want that to be the answer to prayer because she doesn't want to bend her knee to Jesus. But on the other hand, she knows that my prayer, in some, if not cause and effect way, at least after the prayer, she started to lose her fear of flying. Now, if you're ashamed of the gospel, you won't do that. You're not going to pray for somebody because that's just going to reveal that, you're going to run the risk that you're a religious nut running around. And so you've got to get over that you're ashamed of the gospel, the natural propensity that we have. And that's especially true for me because I'm a shy person. I'm really shy by nature. So for me to say to somebody, can I pray for you about a merger decision? I got to get over my shyness, first of all. And then I have to get over this reticence to, wow, I'll be seen as one of those, and I'd rather be in this, what Lewis called the inner ring. The inner ring is all secular people. And I'm this religious guy, and can I ever get in the inner ring if I'm religious? Well, by God's grace, I found that I get in professional inner rings, even though people know that I'm religious. The other thing that I've done is I'm pretty, I was going to say Pharisaical. I'll use that word. I'm a borderline Pharisee when it comes to keeping the Sabbath. I don't work on Sundays. And one reason I don't is I believe that's a biblical command. You might want to debate about that, but that's my belief currently. That's a biblical command that I'm not to work on one day of the week, and I choose to make that Sunday. But the other thing is I'm prone to be a workaholic. And so this would be another area for me where one of the commandments is liberating, because it's liberated me from being a workaholic at least 7 days of the week. Now I'll work 6 days, and then I get a day that I can shut down. When I take on a consulting assignment or when I'm approached to work on a case, I always tell the attorneys, look, here's some of the things about me that you ought to know before I sign on. One is I take teaching very seriously. So don't count on me flying to San Francisco or New York on a day if I have a class, because meeting my class is really important to me. And then I'll also say, I don't work on Sundays. So if you're thinking this is an assignment that's going to involve Sunday work, then it's best to find somebody else. I try to not say it in a self-righteous way because I don't mean it that way. It's like descriptive. If you're going to work with me, this is some of the things you ought to know about me. Now, it took me a while to get up the guts to say that, but I feel in lawyers' terms that's just full disclosure, that I'm not a guy who's going to work on Sunday. Sunday is worship. Sunday's hang out with my wife. Sunday's just a day when and I love my work. I'm really committed to it, maybe too much, but I really look forward to Sundays. That is a day, again, where the commandment has been liberating for me. It's freed me from the pain and duress of being a workaholic the rest of the week. So it's a long-winded answer, but think about ways in which you can, to use an econ term, signal your Christian faith, that you're not ashamed of the gospel. One is to have a propensity to pray for people when they have real troubles. Just say, hey, in my faith tradition, when I don't know the answer to something, we pray about it. Would you mind if I prayed for you? I've never had somebody say, I would really be offended by that. Don't do that. It's been actually quite the opposite. It's more like, really? You would pray for me? Thank you for doing that. That is great. I don't believe in prayer myself, so it'd be great if you would pray for me. And then the Sabbath rest. And who knows what other things you can do about your conduct that will signal to people that you are serious about your Christian faith, but it will also signal to them that you're somebody you can count on to love them for Christ's sake. And that's really important in a world where so many people are dying to have some type of affection or love shown to them, because almost all of their relations, at least in the marketplace, are that of competition and sort of trying to one-up the other person. If you come along and say, I really want you to flourish. I want, what can I do to help you succeed? That will make you different. And if people see you're doing that out of a devotion to following Jesus, that will give them a very different impression of Christianity than that Christianity is for, right-wing Republicans or something like that. Great group of questions. It's been a real treat to dialogue with you on this. This is one of the things that you get to do at Hope College, and I don't get to do a lot of this at UVA. It's really refreshing for me as well.
Well, you've given us so much to think about, and you've shared a lot about Lewis and your own life, so we're very grateful, and we thank you.
Okay, good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you to our online audience and those joining us here in person. Have a good evening.
Cameron, nice job.